October 27, 1942, 08:47 hours, the ridge at Mitaria. The world became sound before it became pain. A shriek tore through the morning air, high and metallic, cutting through the diesel rumble of the Sherman's engine. Tommy Ashford didn't have time to shout. The German 80mm shell hit the tank's right sponson with the force of a collapsing building. The impact threw him sideways against the ammunition racks. His shoulder slammed into steel. The air inside the turret turned to fire and smoke. His ears screamed with pressure. Cordite stink flooded his lungs, thick and choking. But there was no explosion, no white-hot shrapnel tearing through flesh. Before you go, tell me, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far these forgotten stories are reaching. And if this story made you stop and think, even for a moment, hit that subscribe button. No hull breach flooding the compartment with flame, just impact, just noise, just the ringing silence that followed. Tommy sucked air through his teeth, tasting metal and fear. His hands shook as he pushed himself upright. Around him, the crew was frozen. Sergeant Bill Carver, the tank commander, stared down from his hatch, face pale beneath the grime. The gunner's hands hovered over the controls like he'd forgotten how to move them. Everyone alive. Carver's voice cracked. Tommy nodded, his chest burned. He pressed a hand to the turret wall, feeling the vibration of the idling engine beneath his palm. Warmth radiated through the steel, but not the killing heat of penetration. Not the scream of molten metal that meant they were already dead. "Check the hull," Carver barked. "Now!" Tommy moved on instinct. He dropped through the turret basket and into the crew compartment, boots clanging on spent shell casings. Smoke hung in layers. He squinted through the haze, scanning for the telltale orange glow of fire, the jagged hole that would mean they had seconds before the ammunition cooked off. Nothing. He moved to the right side, where the impact had hit. The interior wall was dented inward, a fist-sized crater in the armor plate. But the metal held. No breach, no puncture. Impossible. German 88s didn't miss. They didn't glance off. They punched through Sherman armor like a knife through paper, turning crews into ash and scrap metal. Tommy had seen it happen, twice in the last week. Good men, burned alive because the armor was too thin and the geometry was all wrong. But this shell had stopped. Tommy pressed his fingers to the dent, feeling the rough texture of scorched paint and displaced steel. The metal was hot but intact. He pulled his hand back, staring at the impact point. The crater wasn't centered. It ran at an angle, diagonal across the plate. His breath caught. He dropped to one knee and yanked a battered ration tin from his toolkit. The lid was flat, dented, covered in pencil scratches from a dozen field calculations. He held it against the dented armor, tracing the line of impact with his thumbnail. 20 degrees, maybe 22. The shell hadn't hit flat. It had struck at an angle, glancing off the sloped plate he'd welded 3 nights ago. The plate everyone had laughed at. The modification command had ordered him to remove. Tommy's hands trembled as he pulled his father's slide rule from his breast pocket. Brass and ivory, worn smooth by decades of use. He set it against the ration tin, calculating effective thickness, angle of incidence, deflection probability. The math was brutal and beautiful. An 80mm shell at 800 yards should penetrate 38mm vertical armor without effort, but at 20 degrees, the effective thickness jumped to over 100 millimeters. The shell's energy dispersed across the surface instead of punching through. Basic trigonometry, high school physics. It had saved their lives. "Ashford?" Carver's voice cut through the smoke. "Report." Tommy looked up, his throat tight. "No penetration, Sarge. Hull's intact." "How?" Tommy opened his mouth, then closed it. "How did you explain geometry under fire? How did you tell a man that the thing command had ordered destroyed was the only reason he was still breathing?" A second shriek split the air. Tommy's stomach dropped. He looked up through the turret hatch and saw it. A red flare arcing over the ridgeline, burning against the pale morning sky. German signal flare. Not retreat, not hold. Reposition for second salvo. They had less than 3 minutes. Carver followed his gaze, face hardening. "Driver, reverse! Get us off this ridge!" The engine roared. The Sherman lurched backward, treads biting into sand and rock. Tommy grabbed a handhold, steadying himself as the tank pivoted. Through the vision slit, he caught a glimpse of the battlefield beyond. 2 more Shermans sat burning on the slope below, black smoke pouring from their turrets. The crews hadn't made it out. Standard armor, vertical plates, no angle, no chance. Tommy pressed his forehead against the cool metal of the turret wall, his father's slide rule still clutched in his fist. The brass was warm from his palm. His father had used this tool to calculate bridge loads, stress points, the geometry of structures that carried weight without breaking. Now it had calculated survival, but the dent in the armor told a story no one wanted to hear. A story about doctrine being wrong, about engineers in London drawing flat plates when they should have been drawing slopes, about men dying because someone decided vertical armor was optimal without ever testing it under fire. Tommy looked down at the ration tin in his other hand. Trigonometry scrawled across the surface in pencil. Angles, deflection coefficients, the kind of math that saved lives. The kind of math command had ordered him to forget. The Sherman rumbled into cover behind a sand dune. The engine idled down to a low growl. Carver dropped into the turret, yanking off his goggles. His eyes found Tommy's. What happened back there? Tommy held up the ration tin, its surface covered in calculations. Geometry, Sarge. The angle saved us. Carver stared at the scratched metal, then at the dented hull plate. His jaw worked silently. Finally he said, "The modification?" Tommy nodded. "The one they told you to remove?" "Yes, Sarge." Silence filled the compartment. Outside, the rumble of distant artillery continued its steady percussion. Somewhere to the north, another shell found its mark. More smoke rose into the sky. Carver looked at the dent again, then back at Tommy. His voice dropped low. "How many tanks did you modify?" "4, including this one." "And the others?" Tommy's throat tightened. He didn't know. The other 3 Shermans with angled plates were scattered across the line. He had no way to know if they'd been hit, if the geometry had held, if the crews were still alive. Carver exhaled slowly. "We need to move. Battalion's regrouping at grid reference 7-4. "But Ashford," he paused, meeting Tommy's eyes with something that wasn't quite respect but wasn't contempt either. "Don't touch those plates. Not yet." 3 weeks earlier, September 29th, 1942, 7th Armored Division Maintenance Depot. 12 kilometers behind the front, Tommy Ashford sat on an overturned fuel drum, staring at the wreckage. The Sherman had been towed in at dawn, what was left of it. The turret sat twisted at an unnatural angle, blown half off its mounting ring. The hull was blackened, scorched by fire that had cooked everything inside until there was nothing left to burn. The crew hadn't made it out. They never did when the penetration came from the side. Tommy walked around the wreck slowly, notebook in hand. He'd been doing this for 2 months now, measuring, recording, calculating. Every destroyed Sherman that came through the depot, he documented the same details. Point of impact, angle of entry, armor thickness at breach point, estimated range of fire. The pattern was undeniable. 60% of all Sherman losses came from side hits, not front, not rear. Side sponsons where the armor was thinnest and mounted vertically. 38 millimeters of steel standing straight up, perpendicular to incoming fire. Perfect geometry for penetration, terrible geometry for survival. He crouched beside the entry hole, running his fingers along the jagged metal. The shell had punched through cleanly, barely slowing. He pulled out his slide rule and calculated the effective thickness at 90 degrees of impact, 38 millimeters. That was it. Against a German Pak 40 firing at 800 yards, it might as well have been paper. But if that same plate had been angled at even 15 degrees, Tommy stopped himself. He'd run these numbers a dozen times. The answer never changed. Angled armor increased effective thickness exponentially. The Soviets had known this since 1940 when they designed the T-34. Sloped glasses, angled sides, maximum deflection, basic engineering. Why didn't British command understand it? He straightened, tucking the notebook into his jacket. Across the depot yard, mechanics worked on 3 more damaged Shermans, replacing blown tracks, patching bullet holes, refitting turret mechanisms, routine repairs, survivable damage. But the wrecks kept coming, the ones that didn't make it back. The ones towed in as evidence of what happened when doctrine met reality. Tommy had tried to tell someone. 2 weeks ago, he'd written a 3-page report, detailed analysis, impact angle calculations, comparison with Soviet T-34 armor geometry, recommendations for field modifications that could be implemented immediately with available materials. He'd hand-delivered it to Division HQ himself. The clerk at the desk had barely looked at it, just stamped it with a red ink marker and dropped it into a filing tray labeled Technical Correspondence, Secondary Review. Tommy never heard back. He asked about it once. The same clerk told him the report had been forwarded to appropriate engineering staff and that unauthorized technical speculation from enlisted personnel was noted but not prioritized for command review. In other words, ignored. Tommy walked back to his workshop tent, ducking under the canvas flap. Inside, the air smelled of oil and metal shavings. His tools hung on a makeshift rack: wrenches, hammers, files, an acetylene torch rig he'd borrowed from the welding station. On the workbench sat a British Army technical manual, open to the section on Sherman armor specifications. He'd read it so many times he could recite it from memory. Armor plating shall be mounted in vertical orientation to maximize structural integrity and simplify production. Angled mounting introduces unnecessary complexity and potential weak points at weld seams. Unnecessary complexity. Tommy's jaw tightened. He flipped to the next page where a diagram showed the Sherman side profile. Flat plates, 90-degree angles, everything optimized for factory efficiency, nothing optimized for deflection. The manual had been written in 1941 by engineers in Detroit who'd never been shot at. He closed the book and reached for another, a technical document he'd acquired through less official channels. Soviet tank design specifications, translated by British intelligence. Captured from a knocked-out T-34 near Tobruk 6 months ago. The Soviet approach was opposite in every way. Maximum slope, minimum flat surface. Every plate angled to deflect rather than absorb. Tommy traced the T-34's side profile with his finger. 45 millimeters of armor at 60 degrees. Effective thickness, over 90 millimeters. Double the Sherman's protection with only 7 millimeters more actual steel. It wasn't about thickness, it was about angles. He heard footsteps outside the tent, heavy boots crunching on gravel. He closed the Soviet manual quickly and shoved it under a pile of requisition forms. Sergeant Bill Carver pushed through the tent flap, face streaked with dust and sweat. He'd been running gunnery drills all morning with a new crew, young men, fresh from England, who didn't yet understand how fast you could die inside a steel box. "Ashford," Carver said, his voice flat. "Got another one coming in, side penetration, crew didn't make it." Tommy felt the weight settle in his chest. "How many is that this week?" "5. Carver pulled off his goggles, revealing red-rimmed eyes. "5 good crews gone because some Jerry with a Pak-40 knows where to aim." Tommy said nothing. What was there to say? The problem wasn't the German gunners. It was the geometry. Carver leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. He glanced at the Soviet manual, half visible beneath the forms. "You still reading that Russian garbage?" "It's not garbage, Sarge. It's good engineering." "It's not British engineering." "Maybe that's the problem." Carver's expression hardened. For a moment, Tommy thought he'd overstepped. But then the sergeant just sighed, rubbing his face with both hands. "Look," Carver said quietly. "I know what you're thinking. I see you out there, measuring every wreck that comes through. Writing your reports that no one reads." He paused. "But you can't fix doctrine, Ashford. You're a mechanic. A damn good one, but still just a mechanic." Tommy met his eyes. "Then what am I supposed to do? Keep watching men burn? You're supposed to follow orders." Carver's voice carried no anger, just exhaustion. "We all are." He turned to leave, then stopped at the tent flap. Without looking back, he said, "New shipment of Shermans arrived this morning. Straight from the factory. I need you to prep 4 of them for deployment by Thursday." "Yes, Sarge." Carver hesitated. "They've got the same armor specs as all the others. Vertical plates, 38 millimeters on the sides." Another pause. "HQ says not to modify anything. Factory standard only." Tommy's hands clenched into fists. "Understood." After Carver left, Tommy stood alone in the tent. The acetylene torch hung on the wall, its brass fittings gleaming in the dim light. On the workbench, his father's slide rule lay beside the Soviet manual. He thought about the report gathering dust in some filing cabinet at Division HQ. 3 pages of calculations that could save lives, stamped secondary review, and forgotten. He thought about the 5 crews lost this week, the men who'd climbed into Shermans with vertical armor and never climbed out. He thought about doctrine, about following orders, about the difference between what the manual said and what physics demanded. Then he looked at the torch again. 4 new Shermans, factory standard, vertical plates, 38 millimeters of armor waiting to be penetrated, unless someone changed the geometry. Tommy pulled the Soviet manual out from under the forms and opened it to the armor cross-section diagrams. He grabbed a pencil and his notebook, flipping to a blank page. He began sketching, not the way the Sherman was, but the way it could be: angled plates, sloped sponsons, deflection geometry applied to existing armor with minimal added weight. It was possible. Difficult, yes. Unauthorized, absolutely, but possible. Outside, the sound of another wreck being towed into the depot yard cut through the afternoon heat. Metal grinding on metal, the smell of burnt rubber and scorched paint drifting through the canvas. Tommy kept sketching. By nightfall, he had a plan. By midnight, He'd have the measurements, and by Thursday morning, when those 4 Shermans were supposed to roll out in factory standard configuration, they'd be different. They'd have a chance. He didn't ask for permission. There was no point. Command had already made their position clear. So Tommy Ashford made a choice. Not the one the manual recommended, not the one doctrine allowed, the one geometry demanded. Manchester, England, spring 1929. Tommy Ashford was 17 when his father taught him the most important lesson about engineering. Structures fail, not because they're weak, but because the load comes from the wrong angle. They stood together on the Irwell Bridge, morning fog rolling off the river below. His father, Richard Ashford, held a brass slide rule in his weathered hands. The same one Tommy would carry into the desert 13 years later. See that support beam? His father pointed to the arch beneath their feet. Cast iron, strong enough to hold 50 tons, but only if the weight comes straight down. He traced an invisible line with his finger. Apply that same force at 30 degrees, and the whole thing snaps like a matchstick. Tommy leaned over the railing, studying the geometry. The beam was massive, industrial, permanent. Yet his father spoke of it breaking as easily as kindling. So how do you stop it? Tommy asked. You don't fight the force, you redirect it. His father's eyes crinkled. Angle the supports, distribute the load, make the structure deflect stress instead of absorbing it. Tommy never forgot that conversation. Years later, in the Egyptian desert, he would apply the same principle to armor plate instead of bridge beams, but the mathematics were identical. Richard Ashford worked for the Manchester Municipal Engineering Department. He inspected bridges, reinforced old structures, designed load calculations for new construction. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. And it taught Tommy that engineering wasn't about theory. It was about keeping things from falling apart under pressure. Tommy wanted to follow his father into civil engineering. He enrolled in night classes at Manchester Technical College in 1929, studying mathematics and structural mechanics while working days at a textile mill. The pay was terrible. The hours were brutal, but for 2 years he learned. Then, the Depression hit. By 1931, the mill closed. The night school fees became impossible. Tommy's engineering education ended halfway through. Incomplete, but not wasted. He'd learned enough to understand load-bearing, stress distribution, and material properties. Enough to read technical drawings and run calculations that most men couldn't. He found work with his father assisting on bridge inspections. They'd spend hours beneath railway overpasses and canal crossings, Tommy holding the measuring tape while his father called out dimensions. Together, they'd calculate whether a structure could handle increased traffic, whether rust had compromised a support column, whether a crack was cosmetic or catastrophic. It was during one of those inspections that Tommy first encountered improvised reinforcement. A railway bridge outside Bolton had developed stress fractures in its main supports. The official solution required replacing the entire beam. Expensive, time-consuming, impossible given the city's budget. Instead, Richard designed a series of angled steel braces that redistributed the load away from the weakened section. It's not in the manual, his father admitted, tightening the final bolt. But sometimes the manual doesn't account for reality. The reinforcement held. The bridge carried trains for another 20 years. Tommy learned something that day. Rules existed for a reason, but so did exceptions. The trick was knowing when reality demanded you choose the latter. When war broke out in September 1939, Tommy enlisted immediately, not out of patriotism, though he felt that too, but because the Army offered technical training. He was assigned to the Royal Army Service Corps, then transferred to the 7th Armored Division as a mechanic. The Desert Rats, they called themselves. Men who fought in sand and heat, who kept machinery running when logic said it should have seized and died. Tommy was good at his job. He could diagnose engine trouble by sound, rebuild a transmission in 4 hours, and fabricate replacement parts from scrap metal. Other mechanics respected him because he didn't just fix things. He understood why they broke, but he never expected to need his father's bridge lessons in a war zone. That changed in August 1942. Tommy had been in Egypt for 2 months when he met Corporal Danny Fletcher. Danny was a driver, 23 years old, from a small village in Yorkshire. He had a wife back home and a daughter he'd never met, born 3 weeks after his unit shipped out. Danny carried a photograph everywhere, creased and faded, showing a woman with dark hair holding a bundle of blankets. He'd show it to anyone who'd look, grinning like an idiot. "Her name's Claire," he'd say. "My daughter, I mean. The wife's Margaret, but the baby's Claire. 3 months old now. Probably doesn't even know what I look like." Tommy and Danny shared a tent near the maintenance depot. At night, while others played cards or wrote letters, Danny would talk about home, about the farm he wanted to buy after the war, about teaching Claire to ride a bicycle, about growing old in Yorkshire, far from sand and fire. Tommy mostly listened. He wasn't good at that kind of talk, but he liked Danny. The man had a way of making the desert feel temporary, like they were all just passing through on the way to something better. On August 18th, Danny's Sherman took a direct hit during a probe near Alamein Ridge, German Pak 40, side penetration. The shell punched through the sponson armor and detonated inside the crew compartment. The tank didn't burn. There wasn't time. The explosion killed everyone instantly. Tommy helped recover the bodies. He found Danny's photograph in the wreckage, somehow untouched. Margaret and baby Claire, smiling from a world that no longer included a husband and father. After the burial, Tommy walked back to the destroyed Sherman. He stood there for an hour, studying the entry wound. The hole was clean, precise. 38 millimeters of vertical armor, penetrated at 90 degrees. No deflection, no chance. He pulled out his notebook and measured everything. Impact angle, hole diameter, estimated range of fire. He ran the calculations 3 times, hoping the numbers would change. They didn't. If that armor had been angled just 15 degrees, the effective thickness would have jumped to over 44 millimeters. Maybe enough to deflect. Maybe enough to let Danny survive long enough to meet his daughter. Maybe. Tommy sat on the sand beside the wreck, his father's slide rule in his hands. The brass was warm from the sun. He thought about bridges, about load distribution, about angled supports that redirected force instead of absorbing it, about the difference between what the manual said and what physics demanded. That night, he pulled out the Soviet T-34 specifications again. He studied the sloped armor, the deflection angles, the elegant mathematics of survival. Then he started sketching modifications, not for Soviet tanks, but for British Shermans. It was possible, difficult, unauthorized, maybe even dangerous if done wrong, but possible. He thought about Danny's photograph, about a daughter who would grow up without a father because someone in Detroit decided vertical armor was optimal. Tommy made a decision that night. Not a dramatic one, not a heroic declaration. Just a quiet promise to a dead friend and a brass slide rule that had belonged to his father. If geometry could save bridges, it could save men. And if command wouldn't authorize it, then Tommy Ashford would do it anyway. He had 4 new Shermans to modify, 3 days to do it, and absolutely no permission. But he had something more important. He knew the mathematics of survival. And he refused to watch another Danny Fletcher die because doctrine ignored reality. October 3rd, 1942, 0200 hours, 7th Armored Division Maintenance Depot. The acetylene torch hissed blue flame in the darkness. Tommy worked alone, crouched beneath the belly of the first Sherman. Sweat stung his eyes despite the cool desert night. The torch's heat radiated against his face as he cut through the sponson brace, preparing to reposition the armor plate. He'd been at it for 3 hours. His hands ached, his back screamed, but the geometry was coming together. The original armor stood vertical, perpendicular to the ground, perpendicular to incoming fire, perfect for penetration. Tommy's modification changed that. Using a hydraulic bottle jack wedged against the hull frame, he'd lifted the outer plate, tilting it outward at 18 degrees from vertical. It looked wrong, unnatural, like the tank was melting sideways. But the mathematics were flawless. He pulled his father's slide rule from his pocket, checking the calculations again by flashlight. 18 degrees increased effective thickness from 38 millimeters to nearly 45. Not enough to stop everything, but enough to deflect a glancing hit, enough to give the crew a chance. Tommy moved to the welding torch, tacking the repositioned plate into place. Sparks showered across the sand. The metal groaned as it cooled, contracting slightly, settling into its new angle. 1 down, 3 to go. By dawn, he'd finished 2 tanks. His arms trembled from exhaustion. His lungs burned from metal fumes, but the work held. He tested each joint with a rubber mallet, listening for weak spots. The welds were solid, the plate stable, the angle consistent. He stepped back, studying his work in the gray morning light. The modified Shermans looked strange, asymmetric. The angled sponsons gave them a hunched predatory silhouette. Not factory clean, but purposeful, functional. Tommy heard boots crunching on gravel behind him. He turned to find 3 mechanics from the morning shift, standing with arms crossed. One of them, a stocky corporal named Harris, whistled low. "What in hell did you do to those tanks, Ashford?" Tommy wiped his hands on a rag. "Improve them." "Improved?" Harris walked closer, squinting at the angled plates. "Looks like you dropped them off a cliff and bent the damn armor." The other mechanics laughed. One of them, a younger private, circled the tank slowly. Sarge is going to lose his mind when he sees this. It's field modification, Tommy said evenly. Armor angling, increases effective thickness without adding weight. Harris snorted. It's lunacy is what it is. You're not an engineer, Ashford. You're a mechanic, and mechanics don't redesign tanks. Maybe they should. The laughter stopped. Harris's expression hardened. You got authorization for this? Tommy met his eyes but said nothing. That's what I thought. Harris shook his head. You just painted a target on your back, mate. Command's going to crucify you. They walked away, muttering. Tommy stood alone beside the modified Shermans, feeling the weight of what he'd done settle into his bones. By midday, word had spread through the depot. Men came to stare. Some asked questions. Most just shook their heads and moved on. The consensus was clear. Ashford had lost his mind. Grief over Fletcher's death had driven him to do something reckless, unauthorized, probably dangerous. Someone chalked graffiti on the side of one tank, Ashford's idiot slant. Others laughed when they saw it. The name stuck. Tommy ignored them. He worked through the afternoon, finishing the third Sherman. The hydraulic jack slipped twice, nearly crushing his hand. The welding torch sputtered and died, forcing him to scavenge a replacement tank from the acetylene stores. Nothing came easy, but by sunset, 3 tanks were modified. 1 remained. That's when Major Whitmore arrived. The maintenance officer was tall, graying, with the rigid posture of a man who'd spent 30 years enforcing regulations. He walked through the depot with a clipboard, inspecting equipment, checking inventory, ensuring everything matched the manual specifications. When he reached Tommy's work area, he stopped. For a long moment, Whitmore said nothing. He just stared at the angled armor plates, his jaw working silently. Finally, he turned to Tommy. Corporal Ashford, sir, explain this. Tommy straightened. Armor modification, sir. Angling the sponson plates to increase effective thickness and improve deflection probability. On whose authority? My own, sir. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. Your own. Yes, sir. The major stepped closer, running his hand along the welded seam. Do you know what this is, Corporal? This is destruction of military property. Unauthorized alteration of combat equipment. Violation of at least 3 separate regulations I can cite from memory. Tommy kept his voice steady. Sir, the current armor configuration has a 60% failure rate against side penetration. Angling the plates increases. I don't care about your calculations. Whitmore's voice cut like a blade. I care about chain of command. I care about procedure. And I care that you decided on your own to modify 4 tanks without clearance, without engineering review, without permission from anyone. Men are dying because the armor's wrong, sir. Men are dying because there's a war on. Whitmore jabbed a finger at the modified tanks. You think you're smarter than the engineers in Detroit? The ones with degrees and testing facilities and years of experience? I think they've never been shot at, sir. The major's face flushed red. For a moment, Tommy thought he might swing. Instead, Whitmore grabbed the clipboard and scribbled something with violent strokes. You have 24 hours, he said coldly. Remove these modifications. Restore the tanks to factory specification. Every plate, every weld, every unauthorized change. If these vehicles aren't back to standard by 0800 tomorrow, you'll face a court-martial. Am I clear? Sir, if you just look at the mathematics, am I clear? Tommy's hands clenched into fists. Yes, sir. Whitmore turned and walked away, his boots pounding the sand like hammer blows. Tommy stood alone in the fading light, staring at the 3 modified Shermans. Behind him, the 4th waited, half-finished, 24 hours to undo everything. To restore the vertical plates that couldn't deflect, couldn't protect, couldn't save anyone. He thought about Danny Fletcher, about the photograph of Margaret and Claire, about the 90-degree impact angle that had killed a man who just wanted to meet his daughter. 24 hours. Tommy looked at the acetylene torch, still burning softly on its stand. Then, at the 4th Sherman, waiting. He could follow orders, strip the modifications, restore factory specs, keep his head down, survive the war as a mechanic who did what he was told. Or he could finish the job. As the sun dropped below the horizon and the depot emptied for evening mess, Tommy Ashford picked up the torch. The flame reflected in his eyes, blue, hot, unwavering. He wasn't removing anything. He was finishing the 4th tank. Orders be damned. October 4th, 1942. 07:30 hours. 30 minutes before Major Whitmore's deadline. Tommy stood beside the 4 modified Shermans, hands black with grease and soot. He hadn't slept. His eyes burned. His back felt like someone had driven nails through his spine, but the work was done. All 4 tanks now carried angled sponson armor, 18 to 20 degrees of slope. welded solid, tested and retested through the night. The hydraulic jack marks were still visible on the hulls, scars of improvised engineering. He heard boots approaching, multiple sets. Sergeant Bill Carver emerged from the morning haze, followed by 4 tank crews. Young men, most of them, fresh-faced and nervous, about to take their first Shermans into real combat. They stopped when they saw the modified tanks. One of the crew commanders, a Lieutenant Tommy didn't know, frowned. What happened to these? Carver's jaw tightened. He walked around the nearest Sherman slowly, studying the angled plates. His hand traced the welded seams. Finally, he turned to Tommy. "You didn't restore them." "No, Sarge. Whitmore's deadline was 800. I know. He'll have you court-martialed." Tommy met his eyes. "Probably." Carver said nothing for a long moment. The tank crews shifted nervously, exchanging glances. Finally, the sergeant exhaled slowly. "These tanks roll out in 15 minutes, he said. "Battalions moving to Materia Ridge. German armor's been spotted probing the line." He paused. "Are they safe to drive?" Tommy nodded. "Weight distribution's within tolerance. Mobility isn't compromised. The modifications only affect the sponson armor." "And you're sure about the geometry?" "Yes, Sarge." Carver looked at the angled plates again, then at the crews waiting for orders. His voice dropped low. "If this goes wrong, if one of these tanks flips because the balance is off, or if the welds fail under fire, those men die because of you. And if the armor works," Tommy said quietly, "they live because of it." The sergeant's expression was unreadable. Then he turned to the crews. "Mount up. We move in 10. The men climbed into their tanks without another word. Engines coughed to life, rumbling across the depot. Carver lingered, watching Tommy with something between respect and anger. "You just ended your career," he said. "Maybe. Was it worth it?" Tommy thought about Danny Fletcher's photograph, about the 90-degree impact angle, about all the men who'd burned because doctrine ignored physics. "Ask me after the battle, Sarge." Carver climbed into his own Sherman, one of the modified ones. The tank, designated Lucky Strike, now carried Tommy's angled armor and Ashford's idiot slant chalked mockingly on its side. As the 4 Shermans rolled toward the front line, Tommy stood alone in the depot yard. The sun climbed higher. Heat already shimmered off the sand. By 08:15, Major Whitmore would discover that tanks were gone. By 08:30, Tommy would be under arrest. But for now, somewhere out there, 4 crews had a chance. October 27, 1942, 09:15 hours, Materia Ridge. The German counterattack came fast and brutal. Carver's 4 Shermans held a defensive position on the ridge's southern slope, covering the approach to a vital supply route. They'd been there since dawn, watching the horizon through the heat shimmer. Then the PaK-40 anti-tank guns opened fire. The first shell screamed across the valley and slammed into Lucky Strike's right sponson. The impact sounded like a cathedral bell struck with a sledgehammer. The crew braced for death, but the penetration never came. The shell hit the angled plate at 20 degrees, lost velocity against the sloped surface, and deflected downward. It gouged a deep scar in the armor but didn't punch through. The round tumbled away and detonated in the sand 30 yards behind them. Carver's voice crackled over the radio, breathless with shock. "We're hit but holding. No penetration." A second German gun fired, this time at another modified Sherman, call sign Iron Duke. The shell struck the sponson at an angle, skipped off the sloped armor with a metallic shriek, and ricocheted into the sky. The crew inside felt the impact like a punch to the chest, but they were alive. "Deflected!" the commander shouted. The bloody thing deflected. Now the German gunners recalibrated, trying to find weak points. They fired again and again. Shells hammered the ridge. 3 hits on Lucky Strike, 2 on Iron Duke, 1 on the 3rd Sherman, Desert Fox. Every time the angled armor held. Shells glanced off, lost energy, or lodged in the sloped plates without penetrating the crew compartment. The modified Shermans returned fire. Their 75mm guns barked, sending rounds downrange toward the German positions. One PaK-40 exploded in a shower of dirt and steel. Another went silent, its crew abandoning their position. But then the 4th modified Sherman, King George, took a hit on its frontal glasses. The shell struck at a steep angle, deflected upward off the sloped armor, and ricocheted wildly into the air. It tumbled end over end, spinning like a thrown knife, and struck a British supply truck moving along the ridge behind the tank line. The truck's canvas top exploded. Fuel canisters ignited. The vehicle swerved, tipped, and rolled down the slope in a ball of flame. 2 soldiers, drivers from the Royal Army Service Corps, were thrown clear. One didn't move. The other screamed, clothes on fire. Medics rushed forward, but it was too late. Both men were dead within minutes. Carver saw it happen through his periscope. His hands froze on the controls. Over the radio, someone was shouting, "Who fired that?" Where did it come from? But Carver knew. The shell hadn't come from the enemy. It had come from his own tank's deflection. Tommy's angled armor had worked exactly as designed. It had redirected the force, saved the crew, sent the shell somewhere else, somewhere deadly. The battle continued. German forces pulled back after losing 3 anti-tank guns. The modified Shermans held the line. By the time the firing stopped, they'd survived 14 direct hits between them, 0 crew casualties. But 2 supply drivers were dead, and Carver couldn't stop thinking about the ricochet. October 27, 1942. 1600 hours. Maintenance depot. Tommy was under guard when the tanks returned. 2 military police stood outside the workshop tent, rifles slung. Major Whitmore had placed him under arrest at 0845 that morning, exactly as predicted. The charge: destruction of military property, insubordination, unauthorized modification of combat equipment. Tommy sat on a fuel drum, hands cuffed, waiting for transport to Division HQ. Then he heard the tanks, the rumble of engines, the clank of tracks. 4 Shermans rolling into the depot, battered but intact. Tommy stood, straining to see past the MPs. The tanks were scorched, blackened, dented, but still moving. Carver climbed down from Lucky Strike, his face streaked with soot and exhaustion. He walked straight toward Tommy, ignoring the military police. For a moment, neither man spoke. "It worked," Carver said finally. 14 hits, 0 penetrations. He paused. "You saved my crew, Ashford." Tommy felt relief flood through him. The armor held every time. Carver's expression shifted, but one of the deflections hit a supply truck. 2 men are dead. The relief vanished. Tommy's stomach turned to ice. What? A ricochet. Off King George's Glacis. The shell deflected up and hit a truck behind our position. Carver's voice was flat, drained. "I don't know if it's your fault or just war, but those men are dead, and your modification sent the round that killed them." Tommy said nothing. He couldn't. Carver glanced at the MPs, then back at Tommy. "Whitmore is furious. He wants you court-martialed, but the crews are alive because of you. All 16 men came back." He paused. "I don't know what that's worth, but it's something." He turned and walked away. Tommy sat back down on the fuel drum, hands still cuffed, mind racing. The armor had worked, deflected shells, saved lives. But it had also killed 2 men, 2 drivers who'd been doing their job, hauling supplies, trying to survive the war. Dead because Tommy's geometry had sent a shell in a direction no one predicted. He thought about Danny Fletcher, about Margaret and Claire, about the mathematics of survival. And he wondered, if you save 4 crews but kill 2 drivers, did you win or lose? The MPs led him away as the sun set. Behind him, mechanics swarmed the modified Shermans, measuring the dents, photographing the deflection patterns, arguing in hushed voices about what it all meant. Ashford's idiot slant was still chalked on Lucky Strike's hull, but now it looked different, less like mockery, more like a name that had earned its place in the sand. October 30th, 1942. Division Headquarters, El Alamein. Tommy stood at attention before 3 officers. Major Whitmore sat at the center, flanked by a colonel from British Armor Command and a captain from Engineering Corps. The court-martial had been swift, formal, inevitable. The charges were read: destruction of property, insubordination, unauthorized modification. Then Sergeant Carver entered as a witness. "The modifications worked," he said simply. 14 hits, 0 penetrations. "My crew is alive because of what Corporal Ashford did." Whitmore's face reddened. 2 supply drivers are dead because of a ricochet. 2 drivers are dead because there's a war on," Carver interrupted. 16 tankers are alive because someone finally fixed the geometry. He looked directly at Tommy. "If that's a crime, then we're punishing the wrong people." The engineering captain leaned forward. "We've examined the deflection patterns on all 4 tanks. The mathematics are sound. Effective thickness increased by 20%. The angled plates performed exactly as theoretical models predicted." Whitmore slammed his hand on the table. "This isn't about mathematics, it's about chain of command." The colonel raised a hand, silencing him. He studied Tommy for a long moment. "Corporal Ashford, do you regret your actions?" Tommy thought about Danny Fletcher, about the 2 drivers, about the impossible calculus of war. "No, sir. I regret that it was necessary." The colonel nodded slowly. "Charges dismissed. Return to duty." Whitmore stood, furious. "Sir, you can't." "I can, Major, and I am." The colonel's voice was ice. "This man saw a problem and solved it. Whether we like his methods or not, the results speak for themselves." Tommy was released that afternoon. No fanfare, no apology, just a terse dismissal and orders to return to the maintenance depot. But something had changed. Within days, British armor staff arrived with cameras and measuring equipment. They photographed every angle, every weld, every deflection scar. They didn't credit Tommy by name. They just documented everything and left. By November, mechanics in workshops across North Africa were quietly replicating the modifications. No official directive, no manual update, just whispered instructions passed between crews who wanted to survive. Angle the sponsons 18 degrees, reinforce the welds, give the armor a chance to deflect. They called it Field Mod 14A in the unofficial logs. No author listed, no recognition given, but Tommy knew and the tankers knew, and that was enough. Manchester, England, spring 1946. Tommy returned home to a country exhausted by victory. He found work as a bridge inspector, the same job he'd left in 1939. His father had died during the war, a heart attack in 1943. The brass slide rule was all Tommy had left of him now. He married a woman named Helen, a school teacher who asked few questions about the desert. They had 2 children, a son, Richard, named for Tommy's father, a daughter, Claire, named for someone Tommy never explained. He kept Danny Fletcher's photograph in a drawer. Margaret and baby Claire frozen in time. He never wrote to them. What would he say? That their husband and father had died from geometry? That Tommy had tried to fix it, but too late? Some wounds don't close. They just scar over. Tommy never spoke about the war. When his son asked, he'd say only, "I fixed tanks, kept them running." Which was true, just incomplete. Bovington, England, spring 1973. Richard Ashford, now a civil engineer himself, visited the tank museum with his own son. They walked through the halls, studying the evolution of armor design. Sloped glacis plates, angled sponsons, the shift from vertical to deflection-optimized geometry. In a corner display case, Richard noticed something. A faded blueprint labeled Field Mod 14A, North Africa, 1942. The author line was blank. The diagram showed Sherman sponson armor, angled at 18 degrees, reinforced welds, deflection calculations scribbled in the margins. The handwriting looked familiar. Richard stared at it for a long time. His father had died the previous year, quietly in his sleep. They'd found a brass slide rule in his workshop, worn smooth by use. "Granddad was in North Africa, wasn't he?" his son asked. "Yes," Richard said slowly, "he was." He thought about the blueprint, about the anonymous modifications that had spread across an entire theater of war, about a man who'd never claimed credit for anything, about geometry that saved lives by refusing to stand vertical when physics demanded a slope. Richard didn't know for certain, but he knew his father, knew the way he thought, knew his obsession with angles, stress, deflection. He placed his hand on the display case glass. "Did Granddad design this?" his son asked. Richard smiled, sad and proud. "I think he might have, but he'd never tell you that." Epilogue. The principle of sloped armor became standard in tank design worldwide. Soviet T-34s, German Panthers, British Centurions, American Pattons. Every modern battle tank carries the same truth. Vertical armor absorbs, angled armor deflects. The lesson was learned in 1,000 small moments across 100 battlefields. But it started somewhere, with someone. Maybe in a Manchester bridge yard where a father taught his son about redirecting force. Maybe in a desert depot where a mechanic worked through the night with a stolen torch and forbidden geometry. Maybe in the space between doctrine and reality, where men die because someone decided regulations mattered more than physics. Tommy Ashford never received a medal. His name appears in no history books. Field Mod 14A remains anonymous in museum archives, but 16 tankers came home from Materia Ridge, and 2 supply drivers didn't. That's the weight of innovation, the cost of being right when the world wants you to be obedient. Sometimes survival isn't about being stronger, it's about being smarter and stubborn enough to prove it, even when the proof comes with a price. The geometry endures, the names fade, but the lives saved and lost remain. Tommy understood that, he lived with it, and in the end, perhaps that's the only recognition that matters, not glory. Just the quiet knowledge that when physics and doctrine collided, he chose physics, and some people lived because of it. Would you have defied the order? Knowing the cost, knowing the risk, would you have picked up the torch? Share your answer below. And if you know an unsung innovator whose name was forgotten but whose work endured, tell their story. They deserve to be remembered.